Whoa, hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to On the Inside podcast. We are Sandbox. If you're wondering how the name Sandbox came along, it's Sean, Emery, and Nico. So, hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are listening to us. So, this is actually a podcast where we discuss various topics related to human emotions. All right. This is our fourth episode. The past two episodes, 2 or 3 episodes, we've spoken about self-love, we've spoken about romantic love and feelings. And right now we are live on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, whether you're on my personal page, if you're on my personal page, please follow On the Inside podcast page. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe to our channels. And you can also follow us on all the audio platforms like Spotify, like Anchor. Is that correct, Nico? We're on Anchor as well.
So if you go on Facebook page, you're going to see an Anchor link, and then you get the access to all the various platforms, so Apple Podcast, and so on, iTunes. I mean, you find us there.
Nice. And one of the reasons why we wanted such an audio platform is because when you watch videos on Facebook and YouTube, sometimes you want to lock your phone, the sound goes off as well. Darn irritating. Right, so you now have these audio platforms, and thank you for everyone who's joining us. Caroline says, sharing, if I may, of course, please share this podcast. We want this knowledge to go out to as many people as possible. Okay, so the topic that we are discussing today, it's actually shame. All right, and there are plenty of ways to approach this topic, and for those of you who are not familiar with us, I'm just going to quickly introduce the three of us. For me, I started my career as a pharmacist, later moved into mental health training. Amerie is a clinical psychologist, and Nico is a meditation teacher. Right, so you can see we're going to approach this topic in pretty different ways. Okay, so when we think about the topic of shame, all right, I think it's important for us to set the stage because we might see it in a different way. So the first thing I would ask everyone to consider is perhaps when you think of shame, right, what's the first thing that comes to your mind, right? And I'll go first. All right, when I think of shame, a big part of it to me is like wanting to bury my head in the sand because I'm afraid sometimes it's a self-esteem thing, and there are certain things that I feel very it's not even awkward, right? I just feel like I don't belong. I just feel like I'm going to be mocked at. I'm going to be made fun of. And I don't even know whether it's true or not, right? It's just a sense that I'm going to be made fun of. And it's just a very scary feeling. And that's when I think of shame, the first thing I think of is where can I run to? Right. Emery, when you think of shame, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Similar. So this sense that you want to be hiding, right? I actually do this thing. If I did something embarrassing or awkward during the day, I actually scream into my pillow when I get back home. It's a real thing.
Like you literally scream.
Yeah, it's a muffled scream, so it really isn't that bad. But I actually do that because you get to hide yourself, for that 1 second. And yeah, I mean, there is just a lot of, maybe feelings of anxiety arising from that sense of shame. Yeah, so that's my little thing that I do.
Right, Nico.
Yeah, so for me, when I think about shame, the first thing that really comes to mind, it's my personal experience of shame is like I would like flush red, like, and at any kind of, at the slightest kind of like, fear of judgment, of like, awkwardness, I would just turn red very easily. So for me, it's really like a very body thing. I feel it on my face. It's like hot and red. And then that's really like makes me like want to hide even more. Like there's almost like shame for experiencing shame. And so yeah, this like very complex mix of like, emotions, like, being ashamed about the shame and so on. But at the core for me, it's really about like self-judgment. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So really experiencing or having the fear of experiencing a judgment from others, like being judged by others, and but also at some level like judging myself as well. Yeah, in a sense, like kind of preemptively judging myself before others do. Yeah.
So when you said that you're embarrassed and your face is going to turn red and you're blushing, I mean, when you said that was your sense when you get shame, but how do you differentiate that from like embarrassment or just being shy?
I mean, to me, I don't really draw a difference here. Yeah. So I get that there's different words, but to me, they more has to do with what's the context, what kind of situation you're in. That's really what's the experience. And at the core for me, it's still shame, even if it's in embarrassment and so on. I think it's still the idea of like being either judging myself for having done something that might be improper, or or I shouldn't have done, or thinking that other will judge me for doing that. That's and when there's that element of judgment, for me, it's I can label it shame, and yeah, no problem. Yeah.
So when we think, one of the things that came up in our sharing of what our thoughts on shame were, is this idea of like preempting like how people might react to a certain attribute or a certain something about us that makes us feel awkward or makes us feel embarrassed about. Do you think that this concept of shame is like most people who feel this shame, they are worrying about something that might not even happen a lot of times?
Do you mean like worst case scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people worry about a lot of things, right? And they preempt a lot of things, but there's no real reason, there's no real justification on whether those things are going to happen. Could be worst case scenarios, might not be so extreme.
Well, I think it's a little bit different. I mean, when we kind of, amplify worst case scenarios in our heads, right? It might not necessarily just be shame, right? I think with shame, what we're amplifying, it's not the scenario, but really the other people's response, perhaps, or how other people might see us. Yeah, I think that will probably exacerbate the feelings of shame that we experience.
Is it related to self-esteem?
Shame?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a correlation there. Yeah, because the thing is that even when you're confident generally, you're not immune to shame. Yeah, even someone confident could have feelings of shame. I mean, I think we all do to a certain extent.
Okay, and let me just go on that topic for a while, because I like to think that I'm generally a confident person, yet there are still some things that I feel inadequate about. Could it be a case of some areas I feel confident in, but when it comes to a particular trigger point, then that makes me feel ashamed of something. Like, for example, one of the things that since young people have been saying about me is I'm not the tallest person around. All right, I am not sure whether you would classify that as shame or whether it's just a self-esteem thing, because other than that, my confidence can come from some other places as well. Yeah. What do you think?
I don't know. I feel so. The one thing that, I think it's been my experience, and it's probably a lot of people experience that. Yeah, it's a area thing. So it's really based on your level of like confidence and sense of knowing what's the proper thing to do in a given situation. So I think even if you have a general healthy self-esteem, there will always be situations when you're unsure about what might be the proper thing to do, and then you experience shame. And I would even add that could even be useful. Like there's several like spiritual tradition when they would say there's essentially a person who doesn't experience any shame, who's unable to experiencing shame, there is nothing they won't do. Meaning like any kind of problematic behavior that they will have no issue doing it, including violence, so there's a sense that shame is the kind of thing that can stop us sometimes from certain behavior. It can be a signal that says, okay, that's not okay to do in that context. That's not. So
it's functional.
yeah, it's in some aspect it is. So I feel it makes sense to me that then it's more likely to be there in situations where you're not quite sure what you're supposed to do. You're kind of like very vigilant about what's right, what's not, and then that shows up as shame. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, going back to your question, Sean, I think it's not the feeling that defines self-esteem, but rather how we respond to the feeling, right? Do we allow shame to overtake us and define us, right? Do we allow the inner critic to, dictate our own narratives about ourselves? Or do we respond to shame in a more accepting way to kind of go, okay, here's shame and everyone feels that. And, we actually have a choice to, just acknowledge it and let that go. Or really, engage with that and then live our lives in shame, essentially. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. Well, the challenging thing I think for most people is, if you've gone for some kind of therapy before, or you've spoken to someone who is more, positive, whatever that means, they would say you actually have a choice on how you react, correct, to certain situations. And when it comes to shame, it's in some sense it's easy for some people to say, oh, you can choose. Why don't you react in a more positive way and tackle it head on rather than feel sorry for yourself? But I mean, in your experience, to both of you, I mean, what do you think are some reasons why people find it difficult to take the positive route to managing this topic of shame?
Because there is no positive. Because I think this whole idea that we shouldn't be feeling ashamed, right, is actually really stressful, right? It's quite different from saying, okay, there is shame and it's a normal feeling that we all have, right? And as opposed to saying, okay, we shouldn't be feeling shame at all, and if we do feel shame, then there's something wrong with us.
Nico, any thoughts?
A few, but they're confused right now. But I start nonetheless. No, so there's a sense. So going back to that maybe function of shame, in a sense, like shame is just a protection from us being socially ostracized, right? So it's just a signal that says, okay, if you do a certain thing, you might not be able to approach that person again, or you might not get that job, or it's a sense that you won't be included anymore. And then for many people, I mean, if you think about historically, when we're living in like caves and so on, just not being part of the group means you're going to die within a week. No shelter, no access to support. So which means that shame has really crucial role. I mean, essentially in the past, in keeping us alive, monitoring like how well we do in the group and so on, and preventing us to do things that are problematic and might lead us to being excluded. So given that pretty heavy role, I mean, it's pretty serious role. And I feel like that's why it's difficult for most of us to be just like, oh, no, shame you can just discard and pretend that, just take it as a signal and act positively. Because deep down, no, it's a pretty serious thing. And we really wire for taking it as really something really serious to consider. Yeah. And I think that's where the difficulty lies. Is like we intuitively know that there's something really serious when we feel shame, and that's the consequences can be potentially dire if we don't heed what we think might be the advice there. Meaning not presenting ourselves to others if we don't feel like we can perform at work, for instance, or hiding, not showing a certain kind of behavior, not yeah.
And what do you think is the first step then to move past that?
My sense is that maybe I'm not sure. I mean, I don't have really recipes, but my sense is that just acknowledging that, okay, that's a serious thing and it has its function. I think it's there, because there's a first step there. It's like you're not judging when you do that, you're less likely to judge yourself for experiencing the shame. You're like, that's normal. It's a hardwire thing. Everyone experiences it. It can be useful in some situations. It can be, useful signal. And I think that's that first step of already removing like one layer of like self-judgment, and then from there, I mean, you might have suggestion about how you can work further from that. But to me, that's the first thing that comes up there. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, like in my work, I often hear so many people talk about how they feel awkward about being awkward, right? It's almost like, okay, they have this experience of being awkward, but then it doesn't just stop there, right? They then beat themselves up for being so awkward. And in their minds, it was horrendous because they think that everyone, was probably judging them or laughing at them, right? And kind of like what we talked about earlier, how it really, becomes this massive saga in their heads, right? That made it really hard for them to move on from the whole experience of shame, right? So, I mean, we don't usually think of awkward as, synonymous with shame, but essentially it is kind of the same thing, except at a lower intensity. So we, I guess if we see shame as a continuum, there are different shades of shame, and awkwardness could be at the lighter end, right? But it's a great example because we all can relate to feeling awkward at some point in our lives.
And
right?
where's that transition point between awkwardness and shame, which is more serious?
Well, I think it really depends on the context. And if you can imagine, if day after day, when we start judging ourselves again and again for being awkward, right? At some point that sort of morphs into shame because then that becomes a little bit more deep-seated. Yeah.
What's an example of this idea of someone who is being so awkward that it affects I don't know what was that, it transits into shame, or how does that whole concept work?
Yeah, I don't know about transiting into shame because like we said, being awkward or feeling awkward, that's kind of a shame, right? It's kind of an experience of feeling ashamed, except maybe we don't experience or we don't kind of identify that as shame at a get-go, right? But if you think about the behavioral tendencies, wanting to hide or beating yourself up or just wanting to be invisible, over time, if that keeps happening, if we keep judging ourselves, right, the story we will keep telling ourselves would be, I'm inadequate, I'm not good enough, right? I don't want to be here because, I just feel like maybe everyone's going to be, judging me like I judge myself, right? And if you keep telling yourself, thoughts or narratives like that, it will then over time reinforce the belief that, maybe you should be ashamed of yourself because there is something wrong with you. And that's how it probably develops over time.
That makes sense to me in the sense. So my sense is that when you're awkward, I don't think you think as it's always related to a situation, as Amerie had said. So it says, as Mary said, so it's really like short-lived thing. So you're awkward with someone, or you awkward in certain situations, or just sometimes randomly because something happens. I don't know, like. But then when you experience awkwardness, you never get to say to yourself, the next time I'm going to be talking to someone I'm going to be equally awkward. The next, you don't get to think, it's always be about awkwardness every time I talk to people. No, you're clear that there's a given situations, there might have been a trigger, maybe someone you don't want to have to talk to and you bump into, whatever that might look like, that it's unlikely to be about you. It's just, maybe it's about you, but it's also broadly what's happening in a situation, right? But I think when you move into shame, as Amerie said, I feel like it's when you tell yourself, well, it's not just about situation, it's about me. And every time I will show up, I will feel that way, regardless of what's going on, even if maybe people are open, warm-hearted, I don't know, loving, I will still have that experience of like, I shouldn't be here. I'm not, yeah. So that sense,
and sometimes I think it feels like it's what's the step to take to perhaps adapt to the situation. It just sometimes it feels like it's just a mountain that's too high to climb, right? And I don't know. Let me share an experience, and you can tell me what you think of that, right? So one of the things that I've always felt very difficult for me is when I go to school or a group of friends that I'm in, I'm hanging out with, all of them speak Mandarin as their main language. Right, and Mandarin is not my strength. Definitely, I'm very, very much more comfortable with English because at home, I only speak English to my parents, my family, etc. Actually, even at work, if I didn't have to work in the pharmacy, I might not be speaking like even basic Mandarin. Okay, it's because I had to communicate with my patients. But it's this sense that, okay, when I go to a group of people who seem to be native Mandarin speakers, that's their default language. If I try to speak in English with them, it's just really awkward. Right. And then I tell myself sometimes, okay, let's do something about it. Right. I'm going to improve my my standard of Mandarin. But it just feels like it's too high a mountain to climb because I don't get any practice, etc. And I always fear hanging out with that group of people because the feelings that I get, I feel super left out. I feel like there's no way I can join into that group. And like for me, it's happened in primary school, it's happened in secondary school, it's happened in junior college. In university, sometimes the only thing is my friends came to tell me, oh, you realize something? When Sean is around, we speak English. Every time Sean is not around, we will all speak Mandarin. That's my only saving grace. Yeah, so I think like sometimes this idea of shame, it could be mixed with fear and some other emotions as well. But it feels like it's a never-ending battle that you're just never going to be able to overcome. Yeah, not for a lack of trying, right? It's just something.
So
in
what
the
do you do
mind.
with that? So what do you do with that, Sean? When you have this feeling of shame?
What do I do with that? I think increasingly as I grew older, I tried maybe partially also because of my work, I tried to improve the standard of my my Mandarin to a point where it's understandable, and I don't beat myself up anymore if I'm not able to converse fluently. It's a case of, if they can understand me, it's good enough, right? And then the next step is just how good I want to be. Yeah. And then I just kind of recognize that it's not my main language, and that's okay because it's like, what can I do about my family environment, right? We're not going to suddenly, let's speak Mandarin every day from now. I think my parents would struggle as well. Yeah. So perhaps, one of the things that we were speaking earlier is just acknowledging the current situation. But I would also say that the one thing that gives me a bit of comfort is that I've tried something. Of course, you can always say how hard you want to try, right? Of course, I can try much harder, but I've tried enough, I feel, and that gives me a sense of comfort. It's not one of those things that like, I'm still not at the perfect level. I don't beat myself up over that. Yeah. Oh, in fact, I can share with you something. There's this friend that I used to hang out with. So normally when I speak to a person and he or she is Mandarin speaking, right? And I'm English speaking. Normally it's a case of who influences who more, and that would be the default language of their relationship, right? Not romantic, but friendship, right? For 28, 29 years, I've always won. It was always English. Like everyone converted to English when they speak to me.
Congrats.
Except for one person. Like no matter what no matter how much English I respond, she would respond in Chinese and she would speak to me in Mandarin. After a while, I was like, okay, this is not working. So I tried to converse in Mandarin and I was like, this is definitely not working. And then it came to a point where she speaks to me in Mandarin, I reply in English, and we've both reached this very comfortable stage. And I don't feel like awkward anymore every time I catch up. We are pretty good friends now.
So you've embraced awkwardness and you have learned to accept the sensation or experience as opposed to pushing that away.
I suppose so. But I think also it comes from this idea of where does the confidence come from, right? I believe that if I was generally lacking in confidence, this might be something that is going to knock me back a little bit more than it does. But because my confidence comes from other things, right? Like I believe I do a generally decent job at my work. I have other achievements that make me feel good about myself. I think I generally do things that I like. I'm happy. So that gives me some kind of confidence. And this becomes a smaller part of the self-esteem, I suppose, overall. Yeah.
I think that's an important point. And because my sense also is that once you have that basic sense of self-esteem, then you approach situation where you might experience shame, or even where you're being shamed differently. Because for me, that sense of like, when that happens, for instance, you're in a group and because you don't speak the right language, you feel somewhat excluded. It's like, how much work do I have to do on myself so I can belong, or I can feel I can belong? And I feel when you don't have a good basic self-esteem, you approach it as a kind of like, well, there's infinite amount of work I have to do. Like I should always be working to belong to any kind of group, meaning I should never, ever experience shame. That's what it means to me. It means like, when you decide I will never, ever experience shame, it means that there's no group where I should not be belonging to. And I feel like once you have basic self-esteem, you can be, I'm in that group, I'm feeling awkward, uncomfortable, and what do I do about it? I do have the option of not belonging to the group, maybe leaving the group. I mean, we're not in those caves when there was only one group and you're out of it and you're dying. Now we're in many different circles, and we have that options to be there or not be there and see what's the social cost of that. Like how much are they asking me to change, for instance, like when you think about friends or meeting new friends or whatever. So I can be part of that. And I think that's a more there's more freedom there in the way we deal with group, and that's something that's just a recent kind of superpower we have. We didn't have that option in the past, but we do now. And I think in training or learning to deal with shame, we learn to kind of get that power on and kind of be like, realize, oh, we have a choice, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
So realizing that you have a choice, a turning point in the game.
Yeah, you can decide not to belong if there's like you can be in a group and you don't speak the right language. Actually, that was my experience. So I was in a music group, and then there was a very good group dynamic, and then there was quite a lot of members who left and new member come in, and it was a kind of a different kind of different mindset or culture, you would say, in the corporate world. And then I still loved playing the music in the group. I had still a good relationship with a couple of band leaders that were there, but with the new members that just wouldn't gel. Like my jokes were not funny. There was no common topic of conversation. There was just no way I felt I could fit in, and it was just these awkward silences. And as the group was having those very lively conversations, I was just kind of on the side and just there to play music. Yeah. And so at some point I realized that I don't actually have to. Why do I put so much pressure on myself to belong? Like I don't actually have to belong to the group. I can be there, play music. I have a good basic relationship with everyone. I can talk to them about music-related stuff. We don't have to be friendly at all. We can just be polite with each other, and that's enough. Yeah. And realizing that freed up something, and I felt much less awkward, much less shame actually, and actually a much more mental space to actually focus on the music and what I was there to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and moving on to this idea of we briefly discussed it earlier, but this idea of coping, is I remember in the past when I was in one of my schools, right? So I was the chairperson of the class, and the nature of the class is it was very cliquey, right? So there is one clique, and then there is a second clique, and then there's always the middle group of people that seem to be awkward, that seem to be a bit different, and they tend to get ostracized, right? And when you go to both sides, you're like, the guy is really just damn weird. And so, I mean, what I tried to do as the chairperson of the class is to hang out with that group, right? I mean, I try to hang out with everyone, but really just to try to be there and I don't know, all I wanted to do was to try to help them feel like they are not alone, right? Although it might be hard for the other groups to embrace them, but I just tried to help them feel welcome, at least by one person. I mean, and I'll throw this question to Amerie, right? I mean, what is the role of a person's social circle, or in terms of helping a person cope with this feeling of shame?
I think, it really goes back to this idea of self-compassion, right? Because I think, one of the elements of self-compassion is this idea that we're not alone. And when you have a tribe, when you have close friends you can count on, who will accept you, even when you're dorky, when you have a bad day, right? It's comforting to know, I mean, you're not alone in this, right? And that we know that everyone goes through something, right? When you have close friends, they will also confide in you experiences that, they feel awkward about. And because of that, it normalizes this idea that, okay, you know what, we all mess up sometimes. It really doesn't have to define us. Yeah. So I think that, it is very protective, right? To have, a close group of people you could, identify with or you feel comfortable with, right? And going back to what you said earlier about how you learn to focus on other things in your life, right? If you imagine our life as a bit of a pie chart, right? And if maybe only a small little slice is dedicated to that bit that you feel really ashamed about, then really shame doesn't have much say over how you, identify yourself, or, how you define your life, right? And in that way, we are giving shame less control over us and realizing that, it's just one of those emotions we experience. We don't have to allow that to really dictate how we see ourselves.
And I think that when people see themselves, probably initially it starts with a sense of like, I'm a bit different compared to the norm, correct?
Mhm.
And I think that the idea of difference, like what exactly is the difference, right? If they perceive, if society, maybe it's not them, maybe it's them, maybe it's society, but if it is perceived as a good difference, then it might be a confidence builder, even though like they might feel awkward initially. So let me give it a bit more context. All right. So if most of your friends are on full-time jobs, all right, you work for a company, and then there's this odd person that decides to become an entrepreneur. All right.
Are you talking about all of us?
I just realized. Oh, that wasn't what No, but shit, I just realized I was referring to it could have easily been the three of us. Okay, but the scenario I was thinking of is this, right? That person could easily feel very left out because no one understands entrepreneurship in school at 17 years old, 18 years old. Like I know somebody in my class who decided to go through the entrepreneurship route. And we were like, what the hell are you doing? Like there's no money. Like, don't you think of your starting pay? And you ask him, what's your starting pay? They say, actually, I have no money. You just can't grasp the concept of a startup. All right. And the person who is going through that has to be able to see it as something bigger or something important. And that's where that difference becomes a sense of confidence rather than, collapsing into shame. Same thing, but just perceived differently, depending on how society sees it and depending on how they see it themselves. Yeah, that's just the idea of being different. Okay, so I think at this time it's important to thank right now it's how many people? 3 people who are joining us still. Hello. Thank you for sticking with us. We also have a comment from Kenneth, and I'm going to show that comment on screen right now. First of all, Kenneth, thank you for joining us. And let's read out your comment, right? Kenneth says, yes, I feel we need to come to terms with the extent of our own abilities after we have tried, of course, right? Otherwise, we cannot move on. And I think this is in relation to a comment I made previously where I felt like I at least tried something, like to improve my Mandarin. Yeah. Do you think it's like this? It's important that a person makes an attempt at least to cope with the shame?
What do you mean by an attempt to cope with the shame?
Like I feel better because I've tried, right? But I don't know whether it's just like something that I feel like me personally, or it's something like is applicable to everybody. Like if everybody tried, at least they would feel better in the sense that knowing that they've made some effort to making things inverted comma better.
Actually, I think that's the best you can do, because essentially what you did was you didn't allow shame to stop you from doing what you needed to do, right? It's kind of like saying, yeah, you recognize that shame and you did it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's actually really amazing, because shame, as we started, this conversation today, we said how shame is a feeling that makes you want to hide, that makes you want to be invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And if we could, despite feeling that sense of shame, do that thing that scares us, that's amazing. That's huge, because we're learning that actually, we're way bigger and, braver than shame would otherwise suggest.
Nico, thoughts?
Yeah, so I would just offer like a different perspective. I think both are completely valid. To me, there's a sense, so because I feel like so there's always this sense of a group, and what the values and the standards of the groups are, like what the group's expectations are for like behavior, like what you're supposed to do to belong. Why should you refrain from doing, to be able to belong? And I think in that context, just kind of shame is a signal about what's okay, what's not okay to do in a group often. The kind of signal, essentially, when you're being shamed, or when you sometimes it's kind of subtle, but you get those signals. I mean, we're pretty good at picking them up, and they can be useful also in the sense when you're in a group and you agree with the values. There are people like you really inspire you, and essentially you're like, yeah, I want to be there, I want to belong. And I want to be like them, essentially. I want to have some of their qualities, and some then can be interesting to spot like how you experience shame, and be like, so that shame, then, is that useful? Is that something that maybe I need to change? Would these people who I really respect, who I regard as maybe mentors, or would they do that? Would they allow themselves to do that? Is it up to their standards, and then should I do it myself? I think that there can be a kind of strategic approach to how you experience shame in those moments. I don't know if that makes sense, but just taking it as a signal and be like, okay, how can I use it to change my behavior as well, in a way that brings me in a direction where I want to go in terms of values and everything. Yeah. Assuming you're in a group that's healthy, meaning, again, they carry the value you want to carry, you want to have, they inspire you, and so on. Yeah.
And that, I mean, it sounds like the solution to overcoming this shame is just do it, just go out. I mean, is it as simple as that? I don't know, Emery, is it?
To me,
Yeah.
I think that, yes, when it comes to a lot of vulnerable emotions, right? Shame, fear, maybe anxiety, right? I think a lot of times it really is about acknowledging it and doing it anyway, kind of doing the stuff that actually scares you. So for instance, Obviously, like I get very embarrassed with being live on something like that, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, as you guys would know already, yeah, this is really something that I struggle with. Um, you know, yeah, because I'm generally shy. Yeah, I mean, no one believes it when I say it, but I am, right? And it makes me feel slightly embarrassed to be on air, right? But I'm doing it anyway, right? So something like that. I mean, with practice, it gets a bit easier, right? And as long as I recognize that, yeah, there's a bit of awkwardness or embarrassment, and I don't allow that to kind of define who I am, and I still, am able to find, uh, pieces of the experience to really enjoy, right? Like for instance, this conversation, obviously, is something I enjoy, and if I could just focus on that and just allow that little bit of embarrassment to sit, it really doesn't change very much of the, how pleasant this experience is for me.
Nico, the solution to shame, just do it.
Yes, I would say yes, but in a sense, experiment and double check. Meaning, if you're in a group and you can push, and try to belong, make effort, change yourself. That can be fine if you really want to be there, but check on what's going on with maybe friends, other groups you belongs to, because we always have other relationship we can rely on to validate ourselves, check on our behavior. And it's not just the one place where we want to be. For instance, if it's about work and changing the way you behave at the work because things are not working and everything, you can ask outside former colleagues, you can ask friends. There's always other options, and I think it's helpful for me to get out of the kind of cave mentality of like there's a single group and the one I'm focused on right now is the single option I have. That's not true. There are other groups where you already belong, and there's nothing you have to do to belong there. You don't have to change the way you are. You don't have to change what you say, and you are already belonging. There's no cost to doing that. So that's important to remind yourself of that. And beyond group, there are now possibility for one-to-one relationships. So, we're not just tied to groups. We can have meaningful relationship with single individuals, outside of groups. And these are really useful as well to check on what's going on when we have those experiences of shame and maybe help us process them. Do they make sense? Should I pull through it? Or is there an issue of like a group dynamics that's shaming and that actually is toxic and I should move away from? I think these are all kind of options we have. Yeah.
So it's actually a choice that the person has to make. How much effort do I want to put in to try to blend in, or whether I turn around, walk away, and find the group somewhere out there where I automatically belong to?
I mean, I believe these are some of the options. Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at how, sorry, yeah, kind of just had, so if you look at how that works, for instance, for certain minorities, it's exactly how that function. You might be a racial minority, for instance, you might not belong or be accepted in a, ethnic majority. And then you withdraw from that and you find other ways, you find other social support network and so on. You find other ways to maintain a sense of self-esteem and progress through life. So these sometimes are options. Kind of last resort, to be fair. And I totally agree with Amerie that the first thing to try should be pushing through, at least for some time, and see how it turns out. But
gently
other than that,
through gently.
Yeah, but there's still an element of effort, though. I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not easy. That's what I mean.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize this concept of pushing through gently, right? Because the idea of just do it can be very scary for a lot of people when they think of it as this huge mountain of effort, this huge task that I have to overcome. It feels impossible. And it's this concept. It reminds me of of a book one of my friends wrote. He's a speaker and author. The title is Small Steps to Big Changes. right? Maybe that
Hey, I know
that's
that. I know that person.
Kenneth Kwan.
Yes.
Yes, Kenneth is now the president of the Asia Professional Speakers Singapore. It's a association that I'm part of. Yeah. So the whole idea of that is solution-based problem solving. Right. I think in the context of our conversation in shame, it's perhaps taking little baby steps. All right, and celebrating the little wins along the way, rather than thinking of it as one big task. I have to be an expert in Mandarin by tomorrow, kind of thing. Yeah. And maybe that will make the task feel a little bit more manageable. And before you know it, hey, you've actually achieved something pretty big. Yeah, that might be an easier way, you think, to just do it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, breaking it into small little goals that are achievable, because that would then help you build the confidence to, take a bigger step in the future, right? We need to create little wins for ourselves. Yeah, so that we feel good about doing this again and again. Yeah, I was just reflecting early on what you said, Nico. I mean, I like how you gave this more evolutionary kind of context to shame, like this whole idea of shame being in the context of a group. And I was just wondering, is it possible for shame to take place on a very individualistic kind of context? So I just wonder if on our own, if we're sort of without people, is it still possible to feel shame? Does it have to be in terms of interpersonal dynamics that trigger a feeling of shame? Or I just wonder if it's also intrapsychic.
Okay, I have an opinion, but it's not fast.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I think it's exclusively social. I think it's a belief, really. But yeah, that's why I believe. Because you would tend to think, okay, sure, that can. There's this inner critic, there's inner voice, and so that would suggest that no, it's really just also about you. It's not just outside. It's not just the group. It's not just others. You carry it in you. But I don't believe that inner voice has any other source than outside voices, really, fundamentally. Yeah. And for instance, I have that belief that the way, for instance, to be more concrete, I have that belief that the way parents will talk to a child, that's going to be the kind of words and kind of things that the future adult or the child inner critic would say. But I don't know.
I mean, just thinking in terms of like a perfectionist, right? Suppose, they got a really, in their opinion, not so great grade on their recent exam, right? And even if like everyone else around them gave them, great encouragement or reinforcement or praise, right? They still sort of walk away thinking, okay, it's not good enough. Something's wrong with me. I'm inadequate, right? That's not really anything to do with interpersonal interactions, but more to do with what they tell themselves.
Doesn't it all stem from a comparison?
Yeah, I agree.
To a certain benchmark, be it the pressure to match it, or I don't think it's to be worse than it, right? It's either to match it or to be better. Without those benchmarks, there is no comparison, and without that comparison, then you don't have this sense that I am slightly different from the other person, different in whatever way, right? It could be not fitting in, or it could be the pressure. So it feels to me like if there was this one person there alone and there's nothing else to compare with, then I don't know. I don't think shame will be there.
But I agree with Amerie in the sense, though. So I agree in the sense, yeah, you could imagine someone being just being there in the forest on its own, and and still be a perfectionist, still caring about how they perform at certain tasks, right? But then to me, that wouldn't show up as shame. Like there would still be that drive to really be good and be better. But if there's a failure, that would be really heartbreaking. There might be sadness there. But what makes that shame is really outside judgment to me. The fact that someone else may look at this and make their own evaluations and their own judgment and judge a person based on their performance. You get what I mean? So in a sense, my sense is like if you think of a trajectory about someone who maybe has been freed from shame through some kind of like personal transformation, I don't know, it's kind of like almost impossible to achieve, but any kind of situations that would trigger shame would maybe trigger sadness or a sense of like, being heartbroken, not having that belonging, not being that connection, not having performed as well as we would like to. And with that element of, as Amerie said, self-compassion in that broken heart, something that's really tender, that's really caring, and that's really about oneself, caring for oneself, and also seeing that in others, seeing that, okay, behind those experiences of shame, maybe there's like a broken heart, there's something that's difficult to experience. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll be curious to know. I mean, like if, this experience of shame could be different for someone, living a solitary life in a forest, right? Because certainly I think, in a lot of our experiences of shame, a lot of them go back to, some sort of an interaction with someone else or in a social setting, right? The beliefs stemmed maybe from childhood experiences or, repeated interactions with close ones. And, I really wonder how shame could look different for someone else in a more isolated setting.
Yeah, I was thinking about the different, I don't know, I suppose, areas where a person could feel shame or inferior. I mean, things like wealth, things like appearance, physical, body images, your age, maybe being stereotyped. All these relate to some sort of comparison with some other norm. But how about mental illness? Because mental illness is something that is very much individual to the person. Do you think if a person is suffering from some kind of mental illness, he or she could experience shame even without comparison?
I think that's a very broad question.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't put mental illness or mental disorders as a risk factor, right? Yeah, because I think there's a lot of resilience in individuals who experience mental disorders too. So yeah, I'll be very sensitive to that.
But what about the sense that there's still, I mean, that's a fact that there's stigma though around mental illness. There is social judgment around mental illness. So in that sense, that's the reason why people, I don't know what the stats are now, but at some point why women were more likely to seek help than men, for instance, or, around mental illness at least. So I feel there's some relevance to that question around that. Like, how do someone completely disconnected from social, I don't know if that was your question, Sean, but my sense was like, yeah, someone who wouldn't be exposed to that kind of like judgment around mental illness, would they still get experience of shame whenever they feel that maybe impaired experience, daily experience, impaired daily functioning, and so on?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I've an answer. It's just a thought that came by. Yeah, and I think it's important because I mean, I do have patients who suffer from mental illness, and frequently you hear them say that they are very ashamed of being around other people. I know that this is in context with the surroundings, could be social anxiety, etc. But the stigma is real. I think we all of us acknowledge that it's real. And then the question then comes, right? Like, they would ask me, so what can I do to be better and to overcome this? Yeah. Never an easy question to answer, I think. But, I've always asked myself, someone who is suffering from a mental illness, how could we help them just a little bit better to cope, right? Because I think it's tougher for them. Yeah. Okay. We have a comment. Cynthia says, awesome, Sean. Hello, Cynthia. Thank you for joining us, even though it's pretty late in Indonesia. Right. Thanks for joining us. Okay. So we are approaching the hour mark, and I think it's time that we think of our final comments on what comes to our mind when we think of this idea of shame. I would say that the first thing that comes to mind, and my biggest takeaway, I would say, from this entire conversation, it's really important to acknowledge the feelings that you get. And I think the first step, if you acknowledge it, it gives you a sense of, like, you realize that it's actually okay to feel shame. And then the next step would be just do it, right? But just do it. Start in a small way, make a little attempt, and it might not feel easy, but it's a very brave thing to do, and it will carry you far. Yeah, the attempt to make things better. Nico, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's just two things I've mentioned. So the first thing, that's really there's options. There's not a single group or a single relationships. There are many different relationships, and you don't have to gauge your self-esteem or how you're doing based on one single group and one single relationship, meaning based on one single set of standards. Yeah, you can look elsewhere also for support in being with you, processing shame and seeing what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what's something that you could be working on and improve on, and what's something that really coming from a toxic group environment or work environment. So I think that's useful to think. You can kind of broaden your view and look at other kind of people. That's the first thing. And then I think the second thing is that, I agree with you, Sean, just kind of finding a way to, that's hard because it's very, these are all injunctions and it's all very hard things to do. But I think, my sense is that behind that sense of shame, there is broken heart that's there. and seeking help, learning ways to accept the shame for what it is, so you can get in touch for that broken heart below there. That's really helpful, because then you can see it in other people, and sometimes also in people that shame you, because you can be pretty sure they shame themselves just as much as they shame you, and they deserve compassion as much as you do. Yeah, so there's really interesting work to be done there, if challenging, but yeah.
Amerie.
Yeah. This is a very heavy topic for me, because I see this a lot in my clinical work. Almost everyone who walks in through the door carries with them, some form of shame, and it's a very painful experience to sit with, right? It's one of those things that make you want to be invisible. I hear that so much, and and it's really painful, because when people talk about shame, that they really struggle. They start fidgeting, they get really emotional, because it's kind of like a visceral response when you experience that shame. And for a lot of these individuals, they've held on to this shame for years and years, right? Feeling like it's a dirty secret they can't talk about. And because of that, so many other negative experiences in their life started to just add up, and they feel even more isolated than ever, right? And so shame is a very isolating and painful experience, right? And oftentimes, we talk about, the way to releasing themselves from shame as learning to be more self-compassionate. And what that means is really to, not just be accepting of that emotion, which is really hard, because, shame feels heavy and yucky and no one likes to accept that. But But accepting doesn't mean you have to like it. It just means that, we have to learn to make peace with that, even if we don't like it. And realizing that, we can learn to be a bit kinder to ourselves, as opposed to beating ourselves up all the time. Right. And, earlier we talked about how, when we started this conversation, we talked about the ways we deal with like awkwardness and shame. Right. It's really kind of like acknowledging it and then letting it go, letting that unstick from who we are as people. Right. So if I do a nice scream into my pillow, right, and maybe rant to a couple of friends about some embarrassing things I did, right, I want to just allow that to be. And at the end of the day, realizing that, it doesn't have to make me a shameful person, or, make me feel like I'm defective.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you, everyone who's joined us. We still have 7 people who are live with us at 11:30 Singapore time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is our 4th episode. We'll be back 2 weeks later with another emotion. Can't remember which one that is. But we'll let you know soon. Guan Hin says, Sean, nice sharing. Thank you for joining us, Guan Hin. And yes, if you haven't already, please follow us at on the Inside Podcast page on Facebook. We're live on YouTube as well. If you want to, you can follow us on Spotify, on wherever you get your podcast, with Apple Podcasts as well. Thank you for joining us. We will see you 2 weeks later. Okay. Bye, everyone. See ya.
Bye.
Bye-bye.